want to say that unlike Boyce, who gets all over my sermons with his morning Bible class, I let Jimmy know that I was going to preach James tonight, and I was going to try desperately not to get into his Bible class. It's going to happen, but I let him know anyway. I always liked James. Can't wait to have a Bible class on Bible study on James. James is one of my favorite characters in the New Testament. You'll hear a lot more from Jimmy when he gets up and teaches the class. But this guy, shelled the cob, shucked the corn. He told you exactly the way it is. His speech was so incredibly plain and simple to understand. It's very difficult not to know what he said. Now, I believe, and Kelly and I talked about it many times, that one of the places where I preached, I got fired because I was too well understood. And that's a problem sometimes, being too well understood. And that's why I like James, because he's so straightforward. You have to have professional help with misunderstanding. So we're going to pick up in a therefore in verse 21 that just kind of rides on the first part of the chapter. But since I said I'm not going to get into Jimmy's class, I will just point out the fact that what James talks about for this, really the entirety of his letter, is change your life. You have a choice. You have free moral agency. You need to make a difference between who you were and who you need to be. And that's what James really focuses on a lot. And so what he does is begin to give us ideas of how this can happen. And the first thing we want to look at, that I want to look at tonight in verse 21, is that we're supposed to do something in order to become something. And the way it's done is you lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness. It states it differently in the King James translation that David read, but it's the same kind of idea. You need to quit it. That's what it's talking about here. Quit it. The sin that you've had in your life, you've got to quit. As a matter of fact, I would promote the idea that you cannot be the kind of person you need to be. I don't care how much Bible you read, how much of it you apply to yourself. If you don't quit doing what's wrong, you will never be right. And by the way, I believe God is chronological in the way He does things. And so when James, by inspiration, speaks here, he says, before you can allow that word to get into your heart, at some point in time, you need to quit doing what's wrong. We have a culture who believes that, once you do something wrong, all you do is say, "Oh, my bad," and you go back to it, and it's okay. There are people who believe you can be baptized, and that baptism not only gets rid of all your sin, but it makes the sin you want to keep doing okay. And that's not true. We just have to understand that in order to be Christ, we need to change our life. And I'll guarantee you, just from my own experience, and I'm sure many of you will concur with this, but changing yourself is not easy. In fact, I would submit sometimes it's not fun. Because we like what we like. And as we get older, not that I'm old, but as we get older, we like our ruts. We get into habits where we're comfortable, we're not threatened. Our world is not in an upheave because we're doing what we've always been doing and it's okay and we feel good about it. And of course, that's what it's all about, feeling good about it. When in reality, what we need to be doing is being very critical of our own personal life and realizing we can't be right with God if we're not willing to change. And I know that's hard, and it's hard for me, especially as I have gotten older. There are things I like, and there are ways I like doing things, and there's not a black and white right or wrong about it. It's just that that's what I like. And when you get to a point where what you like is more important than what God teaches, you're in dangerous ground at that juncture. So the first thing he says is you've got to get rid of all this filthiness in your life. In fact, if you don't, you cannot receive the implanted word. Now, I know I skipped the word, but I'll get to it. You have to, in order to change your life, you have to receive the engrafted or implanted word. And I really like the way it's stated there, not because it's up to me to like something or not like something. I like it because it's so simple. Nobody like me can understand it. We were privileged to have a pecan tree in Jacksboro that had been grafted. I don't know whether on this one particular tree, right in the middle of the yard, the guy that was doing the grafting of pecans, which if you're familiar with that, you can graft on a different kind of the soft shell pecan where those old hard ones used to be, and it'll grow soft shell pecans. And this guy decided, let's have fun. I'd have got along with this guy, but he went in and he cut, there were 3 main trunks on this tree, and he grafted in 3 different kinds of pecans. Now, it was a strange critter, because when it grew and it started throwing pecans, It had soft shell big ones over here on this side. It had the hard shell natives over here, and then it had another kind that was a small one, but it was soft shell, which was weird. But you'd look out there, and depending on what quadrant of the yard you're just picking up pecans, you'd get a different pecan. When it talks about engrafting or implanting, you're talking about something where it becomes what is implanted. When you put those pecan grafts in that tree, it did not grow native pecans like was originally on there. It grew 3 different kinds. One of them was kind of a native, but it wasn't like the original natives. It's different. And we cannot stay the same day in and day out with everything we've always done and think that's going to be okay with God. My friends, if you're not progressed spiritually past where you were last year at this time, rethink your Christianity. There's something dreadfully wrong with where you are spiritually. You ought to be getting better all the time. But not only that, notice that when you receive this implanted word, this engrafted word, it is supposed to be done with meekness. And that meekness is a kind of a theme for that entire verse, because it takes meekness, a humility about yourself, to get rid of an old life and old habits and things that are not right in your life in order to be able to receive what you should do. There's a chronology there. We've got to get rid of the bad stuff first and quit doing the bad stuff before it'll ever be acceptable for us to implant this word. But by the way, when you implant this word, it is able to save your soul. When it comes right down to it, there are a lot of things that we have attached to our lives, some by choice, some by happenstance, some by accident, just total pure accident. But this is talking about a choice that we make in order to have an impact on our eternal destiny. We need to be able to receive with meekness the implanted word, because we have in our humility passed up that past life and got rid of it. And that being the case, we now look for a goal, an end game that is so much more important and so much more wonderful that whatever we had to do to sacrifice to get there is worth it. And I want to tell you, it is worth it. But it's interesting to me, James being the James he is, that this theological concept here of getting rid of the filthiness of the flesh and spirit, as 2 Corinthians 7:1 talks about, and we're going to receive it with an attitude, a meekness, of the implanted word which is able to save our souls, then what do you do? In fact, I'm going to jump ahead from verse 21 all the way down to verse 25. My question would be, how do you receive with meekness the implanted word? It is not mental acceptance. That's not all of it in a nutshell. Just accepting something as true doesn't change the way you are. No, if you look down in verse 25, but he who looks into the perfect law of liberty, well, that's the implanted word. Okay, and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. Our salvation depends on our being able to do what we're supposed to do. Once again, God, nature hates a void, and God has given us something to fill up that void we left by not doing bad. When you take away the bad, you don't just sit idle and neutral. You begin to fill it with what's good. That's receiving the implanted word. There's a constant influx throughout our whole life. If Romans 12:1 and 2 means anything at all, there is a transformation happening in our life. We're going from one stage to another, and the faster we go, the better it's going to be eternally. We need to be moving away from sin, and we need to be moving toward God. And in the process, we do that. We actually manifest that by the things we do. And so, therefore, we ought to be able to identify mature Christians. And how do we do that, Jeff? Well, that's quite simple. Look at their lives. What do they do? What's their speech like? Can you see any improvement? I used to joke with a fellow in Jacksonboro, a good friend of mine. I don't know whether you're familiar with oil field language, but it is not of this earth. Those guys work in the oil field, they can, and I'm a sailor. I've heard lots of stuff in my time, okay? You've heard it curse like a sailor. I've heard lots of sailors. This boy come out of the oil field, and I'm telling you what, it was never malicious when we visited, because he was my friend. He was trying to be my friend. But the things he would say sometimes would just kind of make me shiver and grit my teeth. And I said, and I won't call his name, and I said, you got to quit doing that. You got to watch what you say because it's a reflection of who you are. And of course, his argument back was, well, I'm just from the oil field. And I said, no doubt, you are from the oil field. But you need to be a Christian, and Christians don't talk like that. What was really cool is about 2 years later, we were sitting in the office, and I told him, I said, you know what? We've been talking for nearly 2 hours here in the office. You have not used one single profanity in the whole conversation we've had. And he just grinned and he said, man, I'm working on it. It's awful hard. And I said, yes, that's the progression and the maturity that we do as Christians, constantly in our lives, being aware, being diligent about who we are and what we say and how we do things. It is a constant progress forward. But I told him this verse comes to mind, verse 26. You don't forget who you are. There's folks, and I kid you not, you see it as they walk through the door of the church building. They walk in, and all of a sudden, it's brother this and brother that. And then they walk outside, and yo, Joe, what's up? And then there comes a line of stuff a Christian wouldn't say. And you wonder, what happened? Well, he wasn't in the sanctuary. That's what happened. And it's the understanding that people have, the flawed understanding that people have, that geography makes the difference in your Christianity. No, that's what this verse 26 is pointing out. The geography of standing in front of the mirror should not change when you leave and don't see yourself in the mirror. You ought to remember who you are and the reflection you cast when you walk out in this world. And if you're constantly getting rid of the filthiness and changing your life, constantly doing what you should do and engrafting that word, then you will save your soul. Things manifested give away who we are. And I'll tell you what, it's in the middle of this, and he goes into it a lot deeper, and Jimmy will really cover it later when you start talking about that old tongue. He gives us an indicator something's coming. When he says in verse 25, look in the perfect law of liberty and be not a hearer but a doer. And then in verse 26, if you think your religion is good, if you don't bridle your tongue, all of a sudden he's getting into the talking part where he just left the doing part, and he's saying, these two combined together, they tell people who you are. And it's manifested. We can claim to be a Christian. That's what the bottom line is. James is really addressing this directly. You can claim to be a Christian, and you can claim it all you want. In fact, it's ironic because it's so much like the woke generation and the entitlement generation we have today in this country, where people identify as a camel. They wear fur and hump and spit, but it doesn't make them a camel. You're still a human being, regardless. And people thought they were a cat. Somebody said the real fix for that is to buy a bunch of cat food and say, that's all you're eating from now on. Probably wouldn't last long. They'd be a dog or something else, so they get a different diet change. But when you identify as a Christian and that's all it is, but you don't act like it, you don't talk like it, you don't say things that become a Christian, people can see. I mean, we float that fantasy, that image for a while with some people when they don't really know you, but when they get to know you, they're going to know whether or not you're really a Christian or not by the things you do and the things you say. So, I would encourage you in verse 21, lay aside all the filthiness and overflow wickedness that we see in this culture. Take on an attitude of meekness so that you can take what God says in His book and apply it to your life and become the person you need to be so that you can be saved. Because if you don't, James is pretty blunt about that. Show me your works. Show me your faith without your works. You can't do it. I'll show you my faith by my works. I'll show you that I'm a Christian. I'll show you by what I do and what I say. This is a go to it and get to work kind of sermon. We need to do the things necessary to show that we haven't forgotten who we are. Never forget who you are. If you're not a Christian, you need to be right now. If you are, you need to live like it. You need to profess being a Christian, and you need to live what you profess. And so if you're not doing the things you should be doing, let's make it right and start fresh this afternoon. And let's start the new week on the right foot, serving God. and loving God. If you've got to respond in some way, please do so as we stand on this.
Why do you